to have anything in the Gulf.
In the Gulf is
But there was a mine.
so mine hunters, and then there was a frigate for a long time. I think like end last year. But then decided that must be the biggest. No. Kind of have to make sure.
But we should be.
Because I've been doing this job, and going east of Suez. Backwards. That sort of yo-yo has always been. I'm sure it's Suez crisis itself.
It's sort of mad that a country like that should choose between one.
We're a middle-ranking most of 20% of our budget on nuclear weapons.
I agree with you, but a middle-ranking power didn't have the one destroyer able to go.
Yeah, but there was one destroyer that was assigned to go with Prince of Wales and carrier. Well,
You have to bought 6, I bought 8.
well, no, they were going to buy 12.
I know,
the
I
Labour
know.
government
They
cut it down to 6, and the Tories didn't reverse that.
Everyone's been implicit in the same running.
Yeah, to try and blame it. I mean, it's blaming on different parties, blaming each other. They've all been.
I'm not sure the voters didn't campaign until recently.
The voters weren't interested.
So, well, it's apparently Roger read this telegraph article about shadow police. So I said, you're interested about something else, and you won't have time to read it and do it.
I'm not doing that. I mean, it's not a story yet. Well, he was my face is done. Imagine you've got dairy, donuts, and then so you're always done. Tell us to take one in.
They wrote a letter saying that they took a letter to the Navy years ago saying, I mean, they didn't first take it seriously. Stop. Allies weren't taking now, yeah. Vanguard. Right. Yeah. Very one of the new but then they were going to have an Azure core, and they went, what's the difference? I forgot what their name
well, no, exactly, because
they got really upset. Yeah.
That wasn't yeah, exactly. Yeah. That's interesting. And then it is some Scottish.
Yeah. It's not fun. Yeah.
And I'm doing that right as well.
Yeah, that'd be great.
I mean, there you go. I would check that. It's not like, yeah, everybody likes yeah.
Right.
You.
Yeah.
Everybody films themselves that way. It's terrible. Would you?
Yeah. I called us best friends. I don't know if that's pushing it, but that's what we are now. So, yeah, we're going on couple affiliation.
Well, I can't.
Yeah.
No, I agree. We should say, there will be presents about that. We don't do the program, but we'll sort it out.
I used to go around. Yeah. Finish anyway, isn't it? Well, not having Daniel Fisher.
They have me down on one of the days about Tom Coulson. He went out
Story last week, and it was meant to be the week before.
and saw
And this was like, how's it available?
Oh, hi, Eleanor here. Is that?
Yeah.
Oh, Alice, hi. Is it Sapphire?
Well, I think
tell us about it.
And you're,
just
yeah.
two
If you can help with news channels,
straight in the job. That's in the job. So if you can say that really like is attractive, well, like,
So you know they're all.
No, I've told them.
and your ability to analyze.
they are taking it. Okay, fine. Just make sure they get up Middle East.
Yeah. Let me know if you want.
Yeah, no, thank you.
It's fine. That's good. Okay.
Got about 1 minute past.
1 minute.
1 minute past the hour.
They will take a dive just fine. Okay.
Colleagues, just to ask, when asking a question, would you stand, please, just so we make sure the mics pick you up?
No.
Apart from Jonathan Beale, who doesn't need to because he projects so much anyway.
You might come back.
Well, of course.
Yeah, but on the right. Yeah, on the right store.
And we are leaving. So we're getting back to
Yeah, I mean, there is a live bike outside in case the one needs to go back.
we should get back. The one will be back.
The one sent out a saucer. They prefer to only.
I was too fresh.
It's a live bike. It's not. Let's see. It may be dropped.
morning. Let me begin by thanking all members of our armed forces for their professionalism and for their dedication. Right now we've got sailors, soldiers, aircrew protecting us under the most demanding circumstances, and not just in the Middle East, but in over 30 current operations around the world. And their efforts are often unseen, but they are never unappreciated by the British public. And today I want to talk about one such operation. Today I'm revealing details of a recent military operation undertaken by Russia. And in doing so, I'm doing this to expose the continuing Russian activity that threatens us in the UK and to highlight our constant readiness to respond. In the last few weeks, while the eyes of many were trained on the Middle East, the UK, in partnership with Norway and other allies, have responded to increased Russian activity in the Atlantic north of the UK. This operation involved a Russian Akula-class attack submarine and a concurrent deployment of 2 specialist submarines from Gugi. That's Russia's main directorate for deep-sea research. And last November I outlined how these Gugi units, including the spy ship Yantar, are vessels directed by President Putin to conduct hybrid warfare activities against the UK and our allies, specifically around critical undersea infrastructure. And for the first time today, we're releasing images of the Gugi base and of these vessels. They're designed to survey underwater infrastructure during peacetime and sabotage it in conflict. In response to the Russian submarines, I can confirm that I deployed our armed forces to track and to deter any malign activity by these vessels. A Royal Navy warship and Royal Air Force P-8 aircraft, alongside allies, ensured that the Russian submarines were monitored 24/7. The Akula submarine subsequently retreated home, having been closely tracked throughout, and we continued to monitor the 2 Gugi submarines in and around wider UK waters. Our armed forces left them in no doubt that they were being monitored, that their movements were not covert, as President Putin planned, and that their attempted secret operation had been exposed. Those Gugi submarines have now left UK waters and headed back north. And this operation, which lasted more than a month, has now concluded. Our aircraft flew over 450 hours. Our frigate covered several thousand nautical miles, and 500 British personnel were involved in the response. And I'm making this statement to call out this Russian activity. And to President Putin I say, we see you, we see your activity over our cables and our pipelines, and you should know that any attempt to damage them will not be tolerated and will have serious consequences. This also reminds us why the seabed matters, especially for Britain. We're an island nation. Connection is everything, for our economy and for our security. And beneath our waters lies a vast network of cables and pipelines on which our way of life depends. Half the gas that heats our homes, 99% of international telecoms and data traffic, trillions of pounds of global trade each day. And for all the reasons that make the seabed matter so much to us are the reasons that make it the prime target for our adversaries. The UK's undersea network is highly resilient, but the threats are increasing, and so we're stepping up our action to defend it. We're providing an extra £100 million for our vital P-8 submarine hunting aircraft. We've launched the Atlantic Bastion programme to combine the latest autonomous technologies with the very best warships and aircraft to create a British-built hybrid naval force. And we're making the biggest sustained increase in defence spending since the end of the Cold War, putting an end to the years of hollowing out and underfunding we've had under previous governments. Our Strategic Defence Review confirms that the UK faces, and I quote, growing Russian aggression in all domains. And the High North is no less vital to our UK security today than it was when the current conflict erupted in the Middle East. Putin's covert operation failed because this government is delivering our first duty, protecting Britain. Our resolve to track, expose and confront the Russian threat remains absolute. And that's why this year we're deploying our carrier group where it is most needed, the High North, and why we're leading NATO's new mission, Arctic Sentry. And I also want to thank our Norwegian allies, with whom we've cooperated closely throughout. Our shared commitment to confront Russian aggression in the North Atlantic is at the heart of our Lunar House Agreement. And together, we are now building a combined fleet of new submarine hunting frigates and new uncrewed systems. Let me finish where I began, with praise for the professionalism of our outstanding armed forces. They are truly the best of Britain. And when a crisis erupts noisily and dangerously, as it has done in the Middle East, I understand people questioning why all UK military assets and personnel have not been deployed to deal with it. But that is not in Britain's national interest. The greatest threats are often unseen and silent. And as demands on defence rise, we must deploy our resources to best effect. Those resources will rise in coming years because of our government's record defence investment. And so, as we act to defend our interests and our allies in the Middle East, we also step up to meet increasing threats in the High North, to strengthen NATO, to stand with Ukraine. And above all, we will always act on the first duty of any government, to protect our UK homeland and keep the British people safe, secure at home and strong abroad. Thank you. So I can take questions now, if I may. And the first I've got is Johnny Beale, BBC.
Thank you, Secretary. Could you just explain to us, I wasn't quite clear what you think the submarines were doing. I mean, we have submarines in the North Atlantic. What exactly are you saying these Russian submarines were up to, and what evidence do you have? You've given us the base, but you haven't told us what exactly they were doing. So if you could elaborate on that, I'd be grateful. And then also, just turning to the Middle East, if you forgive me, I just wondered whether you think this ceasefire can hold, especially with Israel continuing to target Lebanon, and with Iran saying that the Strait of Hormuz is their territorial water, and essentially they will decide who goes in and out. Thank you.
Thank you. We welcome the ceasefire. We want it to hold. We will do our bit to try and strengthen it. We condemn the escalation in Lebanon. We want the Israel-Lebanon conflict to be brought within the terms of the ceasefire, because we want to see greater stability return to the whole of the Middle Eastern region. On the operation I'm setting out today, this was over a month where we and allies tracked every mile of the Russian subs. We recognised the Akula attack submarine as a likely decoy to distract us from the Gugi submarines. We watched the Gugi submarines as they spent time over critical infrastructure relevant to us and our allies in the North Atlantic. We watched them. We were able to track them. We dropped sonar buoys to demonstrate to them that we were monitoring every hour of their operation. And because we were watching them, we wanted to ensure that we could warn them that their covert operation had been exposed and reduce the risk that they may attempt any action that could damage our pipelines or our cables. And I'm confident, we have no evidence that there has been any damage, but with allies we'll ensure that this is now verified. And the message to Putin is deliberate and it's clear. We see you, we see your activity over our pipelines and our cables, and we will not tolerate any attempt to damage what our way of life and our modern way of life depends on so much. Shibam Khan, ITV.
Shihab Khan, ITV News. Just then you mentioned that you're confident there was no damage, but that still needs to be verified. You also mentioned when you were talking that there would be consequences for Russia and President Putin if this were to happen again. Can you elaborate what the consequences would be and what would be the reaction if you were to find that there was damage? And please forgive me, there's a second question from me as well. Considering there is now increased demand on military capabilities, not only because of the threat in the Middle East, but also, as you've mentioned, because of Russia. Are you concerned about our military capabilities, and do we have enough resource to deal with the threats that are happening across the world?
So, we, having watched, monitored, tracked, we also have the ability to step up responses to the Russian incursions into our wider waters, and these were our wider waters in and out and around our exclusive economic zone, just to be clear, not our close by shore territorial waters. But clearly, to divulge the operational options that are available to us as a UK military alongside allies is simply to make the Russians wiser, so I won't do that. We're confident, and we've got no evidence that any damage has been done to the cables or pipelines. The UK has one of the most resilient undersea networks of any nation, with inbuilt contingencies if there are damage, but we will ensure that with allies that we will verify the state of our infrastructure now that the Russian submarines have been seen off and that they're heading north back to their base. Demands on defence are rising. We see that in the Middle East. We see that in the more direct threat that we continue to face from Russia as the UK, but as a member of NATO. It's a recognition that the Prime Minister set out in his important Munich speech at the Security Conference a month ago, where he said hard power is the currency of the age. And he recognised first, quite rightly, that this is a government that is spending more on defence now than ever before, that has increased defence spending since day one of coming into office, that this Parliament will spend £270 billion on defence. But in the face of rising demands on defence, the Prime Minister said we must, and we know we must do more, spend more quickly. And that is exactly what we're doing. Next year, we will hit a level of spending in this country that has not been seen since 2010 was Labour was last in government. And we do that to respond to the rising threats and to recognise the fact that for 14 years we had governments that cut our forces, that is, in the words of one of my predecessors, hollowed out and underfunded the forces over those 14 years. Deborah Haynes.
Deborah Haynes, Sky News. Just on the timing of this operation by Russia, do you think that it's deliberate, that it took advantage of the fact that there was conflict in the Middle East to try to launch this sabotage potential operation against us? You talk about how you're seeing them, but why didn't you stop them? Why didn't you shoo them off the critical infrastructure? And then just finally, obviously we're seeing the Russia threat, there's conflict in the Middle East, there's war in Ukraine. There's Donald Trump mocking the UK's diminished military capabilities and threatening to withdraw the US from NATO. Yes, defence spending is increasing. You're talking about this 2.6% by next year, though obviously it's only 2.5% on core defence. Are you having those private, tough conversations with the Prime Minister, with the Chancellor, that this target to increase defence spending to 3% needs to be pushed forward much faster, potentially by the end of this Parliament? And if you're still meeting hesitancy and reluctance, are you considering your own position, given how passionately you feel about the need to rearm and get ready?
So, a number of questions in there, Deborah. Look, first, I'm pretty clear that Putin would want us to be distracted by the Middle East. And what I'm setting out today demonstrates that we are not just exposing his covert operation, but we are saying to him that we recognise Russia as the primary threat to the UK and to NATO, and that we will not take our eyes off Putin, whilst at the same time we act to protect our British interests and our British allies in the Middle East. And on the question of this government's commitment to defence, I would just say to you, look back at the speeches that the Chancellor has made. She has quite rightly argued a strong economy needs strong national security. Look back at the £8 billion we're now spending each year on defence, above the level of the last government's last year in office. Look at the commitment the Prime Minister is making to completing the Defence Investment Plan. The recognition that, as I said at his Munich speech, he said hard power is the currency of the age. But alongside that, look at his record and the UK's record in this 20 months since the election, where you've got this combination of strengthening hard power, strengthening allies and alliances, and conducting sure diplomacy. And it's that hard power, strong alliances, sure diplomacy that is a way of making Britain safer, and our mission to make Britain secure at home and strong abroad. Can I come to Jerome Starkey, the Sun?
Jerome Starkey from the Sun newspaper. Defence Secretary, I think this is the second time you've told Putin that you see him. The last time was when you surfaced a submarine close to the Yantar. It doesn't appear to have deterred these submarine operations surveilling subsea infrastructure. And the concern is, of course, when he looks back in your direction, he might see a navy that has 5 of its 6 hunter-killer submarines stuck in port, and the other one was in Australia, has now sailed. A Type 45 destroyer that took 3 weeks to get to Cyprus in response to a foreseeable security emergency. What are you doing to make sure that you know, for all the credit you give the armed forces personnel, but to make sure that they have the resources, the infrastructure, the kit that they need to do more than simply watch? And I'd point out that the DIP, the Defence Investment Plan, this key document to set out what you're going to invest in, continues to be months behind schedule.
So first, I'd simply say to you, Putin's purpose is secret operations that remain undetected over our critical infrastructure. We've exposed those covert operations. We've made clear to him and his submarines that we've watched them every step of the way, and that were there to be any damage to our cables or pipelines, we would hold him responsible. And I think the nature of the operation that I've set out today demonstrates that we have UK armed forces capable of detecting, capable of deterring, capable of responding if required in order to protect Britain and to protect our vital undersea infrastructure. and that we have a government here and a military that, despite our commitments, quite rightly, in the Middle East, will not take our eye off Putin, that recognises and responds to the fact that our primary threat to the UK and to NATO remains President Putin and Russia. And on the question of our Navy, I think this, and our forces, I think this operation demonstrates two things. First of all, just how capable it is of complex operations alongside allies. And secondly, that very often that what they do is not visible. And so I'm proud of what they are. I'm proud of what they do. I'm proud of the operation that I'm able to set out today. And of course, no one's pretending that over the last 14 years that the Navy's not been hollowed out, that the last government cut the number of warships, cut the number of mine hunters, delayed the renewal of our nuclear deterrent, and we can't turn that round as a relatively new government overnight. But we're spending 300 million more on shipbuilding. We've doubled to £4 billion the amount we're spending on autonomy. And despite the DIP still to be completed and published, which we will do as soon as possible, this is not stopping us getting on with the job. And since the election, we've let over 1,200 major contracts. We've made the investments. 86% of those contracts have gone to British-based firms. And so, as I've argued consistently, we're taking the steps to rebuild the strength of our armed forces, reinforcing Britain's security and boosting Britain's economy and economic growth at the same time. Larissa Brown.
Oh, sorry. What type of cables and pipelines were the Russians looking at? And why are you letting the Russian flag vessels go through the channel when you said that you were going to stop that happening? And just very lastly, Pete Hegseth has suggested that allies such as the UK should be taking lessons, taking notes from Israel. Are you doing that? Thank you.
So I'm not going to disclose any details of the precise locations or the precise infrastructure networks over which the Gugi submarines were operating. But suffice to say, we know exactly where they were. We've watched them 24/7. We have no evidence or reports of any damage, but we will ensure with allies that that is properly verified. Secondly, the point you make, Larissa, is a way of reinforcing the argument that I'm making. Despite all eyes being on the Middle East, despite the fact that we've reinforced our ability to defend our British interests, bases and allies in the weeks ahead of the conflict breaking out, and reinforced it further as we've seen the extent of the widespread retaliation from the Iranians, nevertheless, our military is also defending the homeland, reinforcing the deterrence and defence of NATO, and, as you'll see next week when I chair the UDCG, standing firmly with Ukraine. And on the warships, this is essentially making the argument that whilst all eyes may be on the Middle East, Russia still poses a threat, and we will continue to do what we've done as a matter of course, which is ensure that we can escort any Russian warships through our waters, and in the case of this operation, to ensure that we can track any potentially malign activity, and that we can monitor and make clear that we have exposed any covert operations that Putin wants to mount that may threaten our vital interests. Tony Diver, Telegraph.
Thank you. I want to ask you about the Russian shadow fleet being escorted through the channel. Just to push you on that, is the government comfortable with the Russian Navy operating an escort service for these ships in the English Channel? And if not, what can the government do about it? You've already said you want to stop these sanctioned vessels, but they're still travelling past the UK every day. And if I may, the government's been clear that the ceasefire in the Middle East should extend to Lebanon. Are you now considering further arms export restrictions on Israel, given their attacks on Lebanon yesterday?
So on the first question, we're concentrating on what we can do alongside allies, and the Prime Minister is in the region this week discussing with Gulf countries how we and they might reinforce the strength, might create the conditions in which the Strait of Hormuz could be reopened. On the question of the shadow ships, we've got a strong history as a country for sanctioning ships, individuals, and with allies we've seen two things in the last year. We've seen over 200 of the Russian sanctioned shadow fleet put out of action and forced to anchor, putting more pressure on Putin's ability to fund his illegal war in Ukraine. And we've seen the oil revenues that Russia takes from the illegal trade drop by a quarter. But there's more we can do, and as the Prime Minister has announced, we are ready, we have the military options, and we're ready to take action, not just in support of, but action with allies to interdict shadow fleet vessels. And I would just suggest to you, if the action we've already taken, the action that the Prime Minister has indicated we're ready to take in addition, is making Russia reroute its shadow ships, as it has, or escort its shadow ships with its own warships, then the stance, the military posture, the determined work that we've done, particularly with Jeff allied nations, is having an impact and making it harder for Putin to pursue his illegal oil revenues, coordinate and run his shadow fleet, and fund his illegal war in Ukraine. And we aim, with others, to put more pressure in the coming weeks and months on that activity. Lizzie Buchan, Mirror.
Yesterday, Donald Trump said that NATO was not there when we needed them and won't be there again. Can I get your response to that? And are you concerned about the future of the alliance? Thank you.
First, I'm really not going to comment on social media posts. What I can reflect on are the conversations that I've had with his Secretary of War, Pete Hegseth, both one-to-one and when I sit next to him at NATO defence ministers. He's clear about the US that they remain totally committed to NATO and to Article 5, but equally strong in requiring European NATO nations like the UK to step up on Ukraine, which we have, to step up on defence spending, which we have and we are, and step up also on European leadership within NATO. And that's in many ways exactly what we're doing with this operation. We're demonstrating and dealing with allies threats to NATO's northern flank and reinforcing the deterrence and the defence of our NATO alliance with this operation, where the threats are greatest, which is from Russia and in the High North. Michael Shear, New York Times.
Defence Secretary Michael Shear, New York Times. President Trump has mocked the British Navy, calling them toys and old and decrepit. I wonder if you think this operation is a sort of response to that, and what do you think the members of the British Armed Forces would want you to say to President Trump about that assessment by him? And if I might, on Iran, what do you and the government think of the president's proposal, if you want to call it that, for a kind of joint U.S.-Iran toll booth in the Strait of Hormuz?
Well, we want to see the ceasefire reinforced and strengthened. We want to see it extended to Israel and Lebanon. And we want to see a Strait of Hormuz that remains open and free, consistent with the long-established laws of international navigation, without any sort of tolls for passage. On your first set of questions, I'd like to let our actions rather than our words speak for themselves. And I would just say about our carrier, I reject the descriptions that have been levelled against them. Our carrier completed an 8-month tour last year of the Indo-Pacific, in which it led ships of 14 other nations during the period of its operation, including the US. It meant that it is now, because of that operation, fully certified as NATO's flagship, and that is the role that it will now play as we deploy it to the High North. And I think our operation that I'm setting out today reinforces the seriousness with which we take the Russian threat, reinforces the importance of the High North, and says by what we're doing rather than by what we're saying, that we recognise while we've got responsibilities that we're discharging in the Middle East, we won't take our eye off NATO, we won't take our eye off defending and deterring on the northern flank, and we won't take our eye off the Putin threat. Molly Blackall?
Hi, Molly Blackall from the iPaper. Thanks for doing this. On this operation, you said that if there was damage, Putin would have been held responsible. How can the UK hold Russia responsible, you know, if they do take action to actually cut cables or damage them in the future? What capabilities do we actually have to respond to this if it was happening, rather than just track it? And if I may, on the Middle East, you said that the UK is willing to do its bit to try and make the ceasefire hold. What's your plan to contribute? Thanks.
Molly, I gave an answer to your first question earlier on, which is that you see a glimpse of what I've set out today of the British Armed Forces' ability to detect, to deter Russian malign activity that may threaten our undersea infrastructure. We have a range of capabilities in which, if necessary, we could take that steps further, including to respond if there is a question of Russian damage to our cables or to our pipelines. And I'm simply not going to set those out in public. It'll only make Putin wiser. But I believe the demonstration of what our armed forces have been able to do over more than a month says to Russia, you can't get away with the covert operations that you want to mount in the Northern Atlantic, in the UK wider waters, and that threaten allies as well. And on the question of our sort of contribution to the wider Middle East, you've seen in recent days. You saw last week our Foreign Secretary convene over 40 nations to try and develop a common understanding and consensus about how we can reinforce a ceasefire, how in the context of a ceasefire we can work together to ensure that the Strait of Hormuz is reopened to commercial shipping, with the confidence that commercial shipping must have, that it will be allowed free and safe passage. You've seen this week our military planning HQ convene 30 nations looking at the potential military options that could reinforce the conditions of a ceasefire and a free and open Strait of Hormuz. And you've got the Prime Minister this week out in the Middle East talking to Gulf allies about exactly how Britain can work with them and with other allies to reinforce that drive to see stability restored to the Middle East, peace restored, and the long-term protection and security that we have to have restored also for our British interests out there in the region. Peter Walker.
Hi, John. Thanks very much. You were very clear that you think the Russians took this action because of the distraction of the Middle East. The distraction came from a conflict which the UK government accepts was launched by the US without a plan, without an outcome. Everybody knows that basically Russia seems to be emboldened by the fact that Donald Trump is unpredictable, at least in what he says and sometimes in what he does. Is that a fair assessment to say that your job is made more difficult because Putin can take advantage of the chaos caused by Trump? And on a kind of parallel point, is the Prime Minister's role in the Middle East now similar almost to his Ukraine role in being an ally and someone to kind of negotiate things where allies can actually believe what he says and know he won't change his mind the next morning?
So Putin would have wanted us, I expect, to be distracted. And my purpose today is to demonstrate to him publicly that we have not been, that we have our eye on him, that we recognise he and Russia pose the primary threat to UK security and NATO security. And we also know that Putin and Russia were linked with Iran before this current round of conflict erupted, that Russia was likely sharing intelligence, that was training Iranian forces in drone technology and drone tactics. And we've seen the way that what Russia is doing to attack Ukraine is reflected in many of the ways that Iran is threatening and attacking wider Middle Eastern countries. And then finally on the question of what now, where the UK can play a role diplomatically or in defence diplomacy in bringing countries together, in fostering a shared understanding of the threats, a definition of the sort of circumstances that may be necessary for a long-term ceasefire and opening the Strait of Hormuz. We're ready to play that role, as you've seen in recent weeks. Those options are still being developed. Those discussions are still continuing. And the circumstances within which any sort of options or actions could be taken are still rapidly developing and depend critically on this central security and stability of the ceasefire, which is why we've been so strong in welcoming it. And you've heard our Foreign Secretary today saying that we want it strengthened, and we want all nations with an interest in peace in the Middle East to play their part. Finally got Dan Bloom, Politico.
Defence Secretary, are you planning to convene more meetings of the Hormuz coalition in the next few days, given reports that the US wants to see concrete plans out of that coalition in the next few days? And can I just come back to the question on tolls? Britain has been leading this military planning exactly to ensure that tolls can't be imposed on ships going through the Strait of Hormuz, but Donald Trump has mused about some kind of joint venture where the US can collect money from tolls. So do you think he's being serious? And if he is, would we be prepared to deploy British military assets to stop tolls being imposed in the Strait of Hormuz by the US?
So look, Dan, I'm really not going to get into sort of what ifs of that nature. Just simply isn't sensible. It isn't actually doable. What I will state is very clearly what I discussed and stated when I was in the Middle East last week, in discussions with Saudi Arabia, with Bahrain, and in Qatar, and all the Gulf countries are strongly of the same principled view as we are, that a compromise of that freedom of navigation of the seas, the introduction of any sort of pay-for-passage tolls would create a potential principle that could be used and abused by others elsewhere. So we'll continue to argue for that. We'll continue to try and build a strength of international opinion behind that principled position. And in terms of any next steps or convening of meetings, we'll announce anything if that is the case in due course, and I haven't got an update on that specific question for you today. Thank you very much. Johnny, you've had plenty already.
Did you mean that the Russian submarines were operating inside UK territorial waters or in the waters close to the UK?
Well, I'm glad you asked, but I think you may not have heard me when I gave a very clear answer to one of your colleagues earlier on. These submarines have been operating in and around wider UK waters, and by that I mean our exclusive economic zone waters and not our territorial waters. And they've been operating in and around the waters of other allies, which is why this has been an important operation that in parts we have led, but we've conducted in particular with the Norwegians, but with other allies. And I think you've had from the information I've been able to set out an indication of how substantial, how long-running, and how complex this operation is, and how well our military have been able to respond. So thank you all very much.